Well, you know, in corruption research, one has to be very careful when saying who's losing and who's winning, okay? Because we are going to show in this evening countries which may actually seem to lose the race, but it doesn't mean that some people are not making fantastic winnings in those countries. In fact, they are making winnings totally unimaginable in other types of countries. Just a few words, because actually what we're going to do now through this presentation is to introduce the roundtable that we're going to have, where our very distinguished guests, the academic coordinator of Anticorp, Professor Rothstein, Professor Haywood from Nottingham University, and our own Klaus Hoffe, who doesn't need any sort of presentation, together with our colleagues from Transparency International, represented this evening by Dieter Zimbauer, are going to debate with us this latest figures and tentative explanations that we put together. So this is an opening paper. This is not sort of like our final wisdom paper. Those of us who are in Anticorp knows that we have published last year an overview over the last 15 years of anti-corruption. That was a more elaborate piece of work. What we have here is just something to open the discussion, but it is brand new because it is really based on the last evaluations which have come out in the last weeks, you know, the aggregates of control of corruption from the World Bank. And starting from this, we will discuss a little bit the research agenda of the Anticorp and the research agenda of our center, but it will be all entirely focused on this topic. Just one more line of explanation about why Romanians have becoming such a presence in anti-corruption in Europe, right? It is quite a question, I would say, seeing where Romania sits in all these charts, though I can tell you from before that Romania is not doing worse than it should be, seeing the causes of corruption, all right? And that is one of the things that we're going to show tonight, is that who is doing better than they should be, who is doing worse than they should be, that's all right, and who's doing exactly right. So in other words, they're not doing well, but you would not expect them to do better in governance terms, seeing the determinants of corruption on which they sit. Well, the story about Romanians is like this. I mean, everyone needs some sort of motivation to become involved in a topic. About 20 years ago, I was at Harvard with another Romanian colleague, and we were thinking what to do to change our country, which was the most belated transition in East Central Europe. And we decided that what we have to do is a public policy institute, since none existed in Romania at the time. And this is indeed what we did. We collected other people which were just finishing their PhD from various Western universities. We all returned and we funded this public policy, which has become extremely influential in time. However, after working 5-6 years and having what we thought were very big successes, like, you know, adopting various bills, restructuring the government number of times together with the World Bank, making all those, you know, quite detailed plans on how to entirely restructure justice, civil service, everything related to government. After a while, we noticed that despite all this, nothing really changed in the country. And it's then when our agenda insidiously started to move from various policy areas, you know, which are still very dear to me. This is why I'm in a policy school, because I'm really, you know, enamored with policy analysis. I like research a lot, but I also like policy analysis. I like to feel that we have an impact in what we do. And more, we started to realize that unless we solve the generalized corruption in every sector, all these policy studies were absolutely useless. And this is how in 5-6 years' time, every sector program that we have, in fact, was turned into a governance sector. So more or less, this is where I come from, and this is why I have become so motivated. Then, of course, I looked around. I had ideas on how to reform all this, and I could not find any individual leaders to take these ideas because, honestly, they were fairly dangerous in our political context. And then we had to get more involved, and then we had to build coalitions, we had to lead coalitions, and we had to do various other things. When I say we, I refer also to my main partner on this at the time, which was a lawyer. Her name is Monica Macovei. He's today a member in the European Parliament. And when you look, you know, if you just take the collection of the European Voice, the Brussels-based weekly in the last weeks, you will see that, you know, corrupt Romanians may be unpopular in Europe, but anti-corrupt Romanians, like Monica and myself, are really worse than them for the trouble that they are giving the European Parliament, the European Commission, and the European agencies. Monica has managed for the first time to make European agencies compile statements of conflict of interest, because they first didn't understand why this is needed at all. You know, they consider that they can give lecture countries to do this, but they should not at all do this themselves. I work for the European Commission in this mechanism, in this new mechanism which will be issued next year, where Commission is supposed to evaluate the 27 European countries. I can't tell you what goes on there, you know. So in my honest opinion, presently we have to make a lot of effort either to put this on some objective basis, or if not, to stop it. Hence my editorial today in European Voice, which is the first attempt of bringing a little bit the public in there and asking, do we really know what we're going to advise these people? Are we really using this power wisely? So you see why we are about to become extremely unpopular. And now we come more or less to our research agenda here in the school, and we discussed a little bit how to organize this in our team at the center, which is not a big team, we're just 4 people. And we came to the conclusion that we're going to pair the oldest and the youngest. Now, I am the youngest, so I invite the oldest, my colleague Roberto Martinez, to take a seat here while we go through this. So this is roughly based on World Bank control of corruption indicators, which have come out recently, but which we have played with in order to design our research agenda for Anticorp. This is actually our first deliverable in Anticorp. It's called Trend Analysis and Case Selection, because it's going to guide our strategy at looking at the people who succeed and see whatever they were doing that other countries can replicate. Now, it's not a secret for many of you who work in corruption studies that actually nearly nobody is succeeding. So we had a problem with the strategy from the start, but we approached it through various angles, and Roberto will show you next, please.
So basically, as Alina just explained, one of our questions for tonight is, has the world improved in anti-corruption since 1996? Well, what we've seen is that awareness and international collective action has actually improved, and an example of this is, for example, UNCAC. And the dedicated budget to anti-corruption has also increased. And one of our examples for this could be exactly the grant, like the Anticorp grant, which is 10 million euros by the EU. But what is the impact of this? What we encounter when we study corruption is that this is really hard to measure in reality. Our indicators are not really that sensitive to change, and corruption is something difficult to measure. So we tried several indicators and decided to just stick with the World Bank control of corruption. But we do see some trends.
Okay.
Yeah, got it. Thanks. If we look at corruption by region, we can see that most developed countries and the Caribbean are the only 2 regions in the world that basically are in the good governance zone, which we call in this case all of those countries that are beyond, like above the 65 percentile of control of corruption. Whereas Sub-Saharan Africa and the former USSR are in the very red area, in the very bottom. Interestingly enough, though, we see good development in Central Europe and the Balkans. Now, the only significant change is actually in Central Europe, the Balkans, and the Caribbean. And if we look at this by income group, we separate the countries by high income, low income, upper middle income, and lower middle income. We see that actually there are no significant changes, and the only thing that happens is that the upper middle income countries actually regressed when it comes to control of corruption. This is actually also supported by this graph, which basically just shows the number of countries that belong to each of these categories. We see that there is some significant increase in the number of countries that are high income or upper middle income, and a sharp decrease in low income countries, which basically shows that countries are getting richer, but there is no significant change in governance, as modernization theory, for example, would predict. Also, if we look at freedom houses freedom in the world, we see that there is basically, politics don't really matter. It's a pretty stable trend. All of the countries stay the same, regardless if they are free, partially free, or not free. And with this, I will let.
Thank you. So, a little bit more on this, because there's a lot of debate about corruption and democracy, as you are very, very much aware. And on the side of democracy, we like to say that liberal democracies still do 10 times better than autocracies. You see that, in fact, in this top tercile, in this years, we finally have this kind of 50 countries which are free, and only 5 countries which are autocracies, which made to be very clean. And I need to say this because particularly here in Hertie School, we get all kind of, for 2-3 years, we trained, for instance, this very successful oil-rich Central Asian countries called Kazakhstan, because they held the presidency of OCAC and they needed some training. And they came here, and we tried to also expose them a little bit to this discussion about corruption, not only the rest. And all the times they were sort of saying, but why do you seem to imply that some democracy is needed to fight corruption? We really do not want this. We want to follow the Singapore path, which is so popular. Well, it might be popular, but actually it's a report is 5 to 50. However, on the downside, out of these 50 successful free countries, 21 are islands. And if we remove Japan and Great Britain, we are left with quite a bunch of tiny islands. I will return to this a little bit later. And what is more concerning, and where a lot of our work will focus, is that in fact currently 2 out of 3 corrupt countries in the world are either free or partly free. And out of them, 59 actually hold regular elections. So they all have some form of pluralism, but actually they even have some elections on top. And this is, I think, the area where a lot of anti-corp work will be concentrated, because it obviously seems to be quite a lot of discussion here about collective action and not just, taking our nice anti-corruption package, finding the enlightened despot and going to him with this and just apply this, and it's going to work. Well, in terms of change, so what I showed you was just the picture in 2012, but look, here is the change that we are having over this since 1996, the first year when we have the measurement to the present. And if you look at this, change very much cancels itself. We have 21 cases of progress and 27 cases of regress. Out of 3 countries, 12 progressed and 10 regressed, and no significant change at all we find in 151 countries. So in fact, overall, this does not send a signal of important change. Now, you may very well say that, important change doesn't happen from 1996 to 2012. It's just 16 years for changing governance. However, there has never been so much talk about changing governance, about improving institutional quality, about increasing control of corruption, all these treaties and all this money. I mean, this is the period when we should start having something. Okay, just by region now, we're going very fast on this. Changes in Asia and the Pacific in 96 to 2011. What you see there, the thin green line is actually where countries, the threshold, what we call a threshold. It's very disputable if thresholds exist in governance, but we just, presume the existence of this threshold at 65. And you see Japan, which actually has a little bit of progress, and we see Malaysia, who had quite some regress. And if you look around these days, you will actually see the Malaysian government handing a lot of checks for anti-corruption. This always happens. That's a clear symptom when countries are really regressing. They immediately start being very anti-corruption friendly and donating a lot of money to make friends. We also see Fiji regressing seriously. So in fact, news are fairly bad, right? So the red on top is the most recent year, and the blue on the bottom is the most distant year, right? Okay. Central Europe and the Balkans. Here we seem to have better news. There is some EU accession effect. But then again, we consider better news only when countries make it after the threshold, because otherwise what experts rate in countries are mostly attempts of doing something. You know that something happened when you have impact. When you have impact is when you pass here, right? So in fact, as you can see, there is only one clear success story, and this clear success story is Estonia. But there is a lot of movement, particularly where? In accession countries, in countries whose accession perspective is fairly distant, so they have to prove themselves. Also, who started after the former Yugoslav war from very, very low. I mean, if you look at Serbia, Serbia was started from 0, like somebody can, has been in the last row, and this is why it can only go up, honestly. Former Soviet Union situation is unchanged. For many years has been like this. We have only one champion, and this champion still has a while to go. The ambassador for this country, who is actually an Archduchess von Habsburg, visited Hertie School yesterday and told us about the great successes of Georgia. So obviously Georgia can make some friends. And, but they still have quite a way to go, right? And then you see Turkmenistan, who manages the extraordinary performance to really get to 0 after taking some years, but it's obviously on its way. Moving further, Latin America and the Caribbean, here we have a wealth of nice islands doing very well. You see them on the left, okay? And on the right, you actually see a second champion. So we got a second champion after Estonia. We're very proud of it, which is Uruguay. Uruguay is obviously statistically improving, so Uruguay is past the threshold. That means that it joins Chile, who had many years had been the only champion in that region. Well, Western Europe and North America, you would say we have nothing to say here, right? Because it's always been in the upper rank. However, we have something to report. There is some regress in Western Europe and North America, all right? These 4 countries, UK, Austria, Portugal, and Greece regressed. And for Greece, the regress is actually really underneath. Okay, it might be that the experts, in fact, rated Greece too favorably before, and now after the fiscal deficit started, everyone out of the sudden agrees that Greece is a very corrupt country, but that when they were successful, this was not very well remarked by people. What about Sub-Saharan Africa? Well, in Sub-Saharan Africa, which is one of the main focuses of anti-corruption policy, we have 2 countries which progressed, which are Cape Verde and Rwanda. Rwanda, fairly unbelievable, you would say. Look at this. Rwanda is past 70. We had a lot of doubts. We started to corroborate. We started to get evidence from everywhere these days. You know, and then 2 days ago, we got this call from the African Union inviting us to Rwanda to speak on anti-corruption December Day, because they probably heard that we do not believe this, and they wanted to show that themselves, okay? But then we have Namibia and South Africa, which, as you can see, they actually fallen below the threshold. So, some enlightened despots here, 2 countries doing very well, which have passed the threshold in this interval, and which are United Arab Emirates and Qatar. I'm going into your slides, right?
No.
No? This one not yours? I thought it was yours.
You're fine.
We rehearsed. We wanted to rehearse, but we never had the time to do this. So, okay. And Cyprus and Israel, whom you would believe safe, who in fact significantly regressed.
Now
Okay, that is yours.
So basically, this slide shows no surprises. These are just the regional achievers, which are the 3 countries that are on top of the control of corruption rating by region. We see basically the usual suspects, Denmark, Sweden, and Finland in Western Europe, for example, but some pretty interesting cases, like Alina mentioned, the United Arab Emirates and Qatar in the MENA region, and Rwanda now, that although Alina doesn't like it, I still included it.
No, I like it. I mean, I'm so happy to get any additional case. Just a word of clarification, all right? So we adopt 3 strategies here. One strategy is to look at significant change, but whoever works with these indicators know that significant change is scarce due to their nature of aggregated indicators. So in fact, confidence error is so big that it might be that this is why we miss change, all right? Our second strategy is this one. We simply look who is doing better than the region, because we presume that there is some contextual regionalized kind of approach to corruption. And our third example is that we simply use a regression model with the main components of modernization, because we know that this modernity determinants explain so much of corruption, and then we use that to see if countries are doing better than the structural predictors would imply, or are doing worse, or are doing just right, okay? So this is our second approach to the same countries in order to get some, better idea of that.
Exactly, and we also have in Latin America, Chile and Uruguay, that by now have ratings similar to the ones in Western Europe. And now...
And Costa Rica, don't forget Costa Rica.
Yeah, Costa Rica also improved, and it's up there.
So,
and these are our underachievers or our underperformers by region. We basically have no big surprises here. Only the interesting case, for example, is China, which is doing amazingly well economically, but still is in the very bottom of the governance, in the very bottom tercile of governance.
Okay, so this is from 0 to 100?
That is from 0 to 100, okay, exactly. Right. And China is below the regional average for Asia and the Pacific, which is 42.7.
So it's already fairly low, right?
Exactly. And I mean, the rest of the countries are basically some failed states, some authoritarian states, etc., etc. So they're
Okay,
basically...
but you also see that Western Europe and North America, Greece, Italy, and Spain,
Spain.
are below the average for this reason. So
Exactly.
this is very much like in the news.
And now basically who are doing better than expected and who are doing worse than expected. Basically, we just compare some of the modernization variables here, and we selected some of the countries that are actually doing better than the modernization theory would predict and doing worse than the modernization theory would predict. Here we have some interesting cases. Again, we have Rwanda, and in sub-Saharan Africa, we also have Zambia. In Central Europe and the Balkans, we have Croatia. And in Latin America, we have Peru and El Salvador doing better than we would expect from their economic development, literacy rates, and life expectancy, for example. And in Asia and the Pacific, we have again...
But here we no longer discuss the upper third, right?
Yeah.
So Peru and El Salvador are doing better, but they're not doing good enough. They're
exactly.
not above 65.
And in Asia and the Pacific, we have, again, some small, nice islands.
And who's doing worse? I mean, famous cases like Argentina and Mexico, yes.
Yeah, Argentina and my beloved home country down there.
That's his beloved home country.
And also Kenya in sub-Saharan Africa, which is pretty bad. And now we come to a very controversial slide. Lena never really liked it, but I still managed to include it. These are basically our most significant changes in control of corruption, the so-called transitions. These are countries that managed to go from the lowest tercile to the middle tercile and from the middle tercile to the highest tercile. As we see in the top, we have basically Estonia and Uruguay and two autocracies, which are the United Arab Emirates and Qatar, and again, some small islands. And I also included Rwanda.
And Rwanda, which went from the bottom to up.
To the very
Rwanda
top.
actually went 2 categories of governance. All right, and we looked a little bit at this. We also talked with our World Bank colleagues. Why did this happen? You know, it happened a lot on behalf of ease of doing business indicator, which is, again, another reason why people criticize these indicators, that they cater a little bit too much to business and other things. But not only that. So we have been checking on this Rwandan case, and now we're going to do a field trip to this Rwandan case to understand what goes on there and if it's really worth replicating.
If we manage to move your class.
If we manage to move my class, yes.
And we have now the ones that regressed, or the ones that we shouldn't emulate, although really here we don't have. I mean, we have, again, China going down from the middle tercile to the lowest one. Turkmenistan, which basically collapsed. And the Maldives, who went from the very top tercile to the lowest tercile. And yeah, again, Greece in the top, and South Africa, which actually was an overperformer in Africa for quite a while, and now is just where the modernization theory would predict, and in the middle tercile. So.
Okay, that's me, right?
That's you again.
Okay. So, general research question in Anticorp is actually what determines this evolution from one governance regime to another, and can this be influenced by human agency in the medium term? And more narrowly, what we're trying to do here is to understand the successful change trajectories. And since we do not have enough contemporary cases, we look at some historical cases as well. We try to connect anti-corruption intervention, for instance, EU policy, or in fact implementations of United Convention Against Corruption with the country evolution to establish some sort of before and after experimental design. And finally, we're interested in designing interventions wherever interventions can probably create largest impact. In other words, in what we define as borderline cases, countries which seem fairly near. In Anticorp, therefore, we find various things. We do these waves of achievement. We do analytic transitions of this to good governance. We do ethnographic and policy analysis of this anti-corruption intervention. We will do a pan-European survey of corruption and quality of government at regional level. And we'll also do, I mean, our colleagues from Transparency International will do a global survey of values and collective action attitudes. And the interesting part of this is that besides the global survey of values, you are actually going to look de facto of some collective action situations. So this is what we offer to have this discussion from now on, and we will start with, you know, any obvious lesson which would come out of this, of rather experiences of our distinguished panelists, and we just go through these three, and then we will open to the public and to the cocktail, actually. So I would like very much to invite our panelists now to join us here. And thank you, Roberto.